morning sun had just begun to climb over the horizon, casting a soft golden glow over London's Gatwick Airport. Outside, the runways shimmered faintly under the thin layer of fog that drifted lazily across the tarmac. The day looked perfect for flying. Clear skies, light winds, and a sense of calm that wrapped around the bustling terminal like a blanket of quiet efficiency. Inside Gate 47, passengers for EasyJet Flight 202 to Geneva were slowly gathering. Some chatted excitedly about their plans in Switzerland, business meetings, weekend trips, or reunions with friends. Others scrolled through their phones, lost in the digital rhythm of their own worlds. The atmosphere was ordinary, even peaceful, the kind of morning where nothing ever seemed likely to go wrong. A young mother sat near the window, gently rocking her baby to sleep while her husband flipped through a travel magazine. A group of students nearby whispered and laughed, comparing boarding passes and teasing each other about who would get the window seat. Further down the row sat an elderly couple, he reading the newspaper, she quietly knitting, pausing occasionally to glance lovingly at her husband. And then, there was seat 18B. The man sitting there didn't quite blend in. Mid-30s medium build, short dark hair. He wore a black jacket despite the mild temperature, and his hands fidgeted constantly, tapping his leg, adjusting his watch, opening and closing the zipper of his bag. Every few minutes, his eyes darted around the cabin, to the crew, to the passengers, to the emergency exits. He wasn't drawing attention exactly, but something about him carried a strange restlessness. Flight attendants moved gracefully through the aisle, performing their routine checks. "Good morning, sir. Can I take your boarding pass, please?" "Cabin secure," one of them called to the captain through the intercom. The hum of engines outside grew louder as the aircraft prepared for taxi. As the man in 18B buckled his seatbelt, his knee bounced uncontrollably. He exhaled sharply, muttering something under his breath that the woman next to him couldn't quite catch. She smiled politely, assuming he was just a nervous flyer. Little did anyone know that this quiet man's presence would soon change the entire flight's course, turning a simple journey into an unforgettable nightmare. The captain's voice came over the speaker, warm and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard EasyJet Flight 202 bound for Geneva. Flight time today will be approximately 1 hour and 20 minutes. Weather en route looks clear, so sit back, relax, and enjoy your flight." The engines roared to life, vibrating through the floor. The plane rolled down the runway, gathering speed. Passengers leaned back in their seats, feeling that familiar surge of power as the aircraft lifted off the ground, London shrinking beneath them. From the window, the sunrise painted the clouds in streaks of orange and pink. A few passengers took photos. Others closed their eyes, letting the rhythm of flight lull them into relaxation. Flight attendants began moving again, preparing to serve coffee and snacks. Everything seemed beautifully ordinary, but for the man in 18B, calm was impossible. He kept glancing at his phone, scrolling through old photos and messages. His lips moved slightly, whispering words no one else could hear. A bead of sweat trickled down his temple, even though the cabin was cool. At one point, he closed his eyes tightly and pressed his hands together, not in prayer, but in frustration. The woman beside him tried to start a conversation. "First time flying EasyJet?" she asked kindly. He didn't respond. His jaw tightened, his gaze fixed ahead. After a long, uncomfortable silence, she turned away, pretending to sleep. Rows ahead, a flight attendant noticed him fidgeting. She made a mental note to check on him later, perhaps offer some water. Nervous passengers were common, nothing unusual about that. 20 minutes into the flight, the cabin was quiet except for the hum of the engines and the occasional rustle of a newspaper. Children colored in their activity books. Businessmen opened laptops. The captain adjusted altitude, and the seatbelt sign flicked off with a familiar ding. People began unbuckling, stretching, moving to the restroom. Everything, absolutely everything, appeared normal. But beneath that layer of routine calm, a silent storm was brewing. The man in 18B's breathing grew heavier. His hand trembled slightly as he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone again. He opened the Notes app, stared at a few lines of text, then locked it immediately. He exhaled shakily, his heart pounding faster with each passing minute. Outside the window, the clouds stretched endlessly, calm, white, and innocent. Inside, no one noticed that one passenger's anxiety was turning into something darker. The flight attendant finally approached him with a soft smile. "Sir, are you feeling all right? Can I get you some water?" He looked up, startled, eyes wide, voice trembling. No, I'm fine," he said quickly, forcing a smile. But the moment she walked away, his expression shifted, from nervousness to something far more intense. He clenched his fists, staring straight ahead, whispering words again, this time more clearly, almost chanting under his breath. The calm before the chaos was about to end. No one could have predicted that within the next few minutes, those whispers would turn into screams that would echo across the cabin, and that EasyJet Flight 202 would soon make international headlines. The first 30 minutes of the flight had passed without incident. The seatbelt sign was off, the cabin smelled faintly of coffee, and a thin band of sunlight poured through the windows. Passengers relaxed into their seats, lulled by the gentle hum of the engines. The world outside was a soft ocean of clouds, peaceful, endless, unbroken. Then the calm began to unravel. A light tremor rippled through the aircraft, the kind of turbulence that usually earns a few nervous laughs. Overhead bins rattled, coffee cups wobbled on tray tables. The captain's voice came through, calm and routine. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're passing through a bit of rough air. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." Most passengers complied at once, but in row 18, something entirely different was happening. The man who had sat silent and restless earlier now pressed both palms against the seat in front of him, eyes wide, chest heaving. His breathing had changed, faster, shallower, almost panicked. The woman beside him noticed first. "Sir, are you okay?" she asked softly. He didn't answer. Instead, he mumbled to himself, the words broken and frantic, as if arguing with a voice only he could hear. The turbulence intensified, jolting the plane. The cabin filled with the sound of rattling trays and startled gasps. A flight attendant moved quickly down the aisle to reassure passengers. When she reached row 18, the man suddenly shot to his feet. His seatbelt snapped loose, and before anyone could react, his voice thundered through the cabin. "Death to Trump! Bomb the plane!" The words cut through the air like a blade. For a heartbeat, there was silence, stunned, disbelieving silence. Then the cabin erupted into chaos. A child screamed. Someone shouted for help. Coffee splashed onto the floor as passengers ducked down instinctively, hands over their heads. The woman in the aisle seat stumbled backward, knocking over a drink cart. The man stood tall, trembling with fury. His face was red, his eyes wild, his hands clenched into fists. "Do you hear me?" he shouted again. "Death to Trump! Bomb the plane!" Every word seemed to echo against the cabin walls. The flight attendants froze mid-motion, their training telling them to stay calm, but their instincts screaming otherwise. One of them, Claire, took a cautious step forward, palms raised. "Sir, please, you need to sit down," she said, her voice steady but tight. He glared at her, breathing hard. "No one understands," he hissed. "They're all the same. Liars, killers, politicians." The plane lurched again. Overhead lights flickered. Several passengers began praying quietly. A man in the back row fumbled for his phone, trying to record what was happening. But another shouted, "Put that away." "He's serious!" Claire tapped her radio and whispered to the captain, "Possible threat in cabin. Passenger yelling bomb. Row 18. The response came immediately. "Copy. Lock cockpit. Hold position." Inside the cockpit, the pilot sealed the reinforced door and switched to emergency code procedures. A call went out to air traffic control. Possible in-flight disturbance. Back in the cabin, 2 male passengers, one a former security guard, the other a teacher, exchanged looks. They didn't need to speak. The decision was clear. Slowly, they unbuckled their seatbelts and stood up, moving toward the shouting man. "Hey, mate," one of them said, voice firm but calm. "Let's sit down and talk, all right?" "You're scaring people." The man's eyes darted between them. For a second, it looked as if he might calm down. His shoulders lowered slightly. But then another bump of turbulence hit, and something inside him snapped again. "Don't touch me!" he roared, swinging his arm wildly. The teacher ducked just in time. Gasps filled the air again. Claire reached for the emergency restraints, the plastic zip cuffs carried for exactly these situations, and nodded to her colleague across the aisle. They had trained for this, but training didn't prepare you for the sound of children crying or the sight of terrified faces all around. The captain made an announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated and calm. We have the situation under control." His voice was calm, but even through the intercom, it carried an edge of tension. The two volunteers moved in. One grabbed the man's arm. The other tried to pin his shoulder. He thrashed violently, shouting incoherently about government's lies and revenge. "Bomb the plane!" "They'll hear me now!" He screamed, but the words slurred, a sign of intoxication. The sharp scent of alcohol filled the air. After a brief struggle, the men managed to push him back into his seat. Claire and another attendant quickly looped the restraints around his wrists. He kicked, shouted, then finally sagged forward, panting heavily, sweat dripping from his forehead. For a moment, no one moved. The only sound was the steady hum of the engines and the distant whimpering of a child. Then slowly a wave of whispering spread through the cabin. "Is there really a bomb? Is he drunk? Are we going to land?" Claire knelt beside the restrained man, speaking softly but firmly. "Sir, listen to me. You're safe. You need to stay calm." He didn't answer. His head dropped, eyes unfocused, muttering something about voices and corruption. The turbulence eased, but the fear lingered. Every passenger stared forward, motionless, waiting for the next command. A few minutes later, the captain's voice returned. "This is your captain. We're diverting to Lyon for safety. Please remain seated until further notice." The flight attendants began checking rows, their professionalism returning like armor. Passengers whispered prayers of relief. The ordeal wasn't over, but help was waiting below. At the back of the plane, the man in 18B sat cuffed and silent, staring at nothing. The rage that had exploded moments earlier had drained away, leaving only exhaustion and an eerie quiet. The outburst was over. But for everyone on board, the memory of those words, "Death to Trump, bomb the plane," would echo long after the wheels touched down. Inside the EasyJet cabin, the air had changed. Moments earlier, it had smelled faintly of coffee and perfume. But now it was thick with fear, a sharp, invisible tension that pressed against everyone's chest. Every eye was locked on row 18, where the restrained man struggled wildly, his wrists bound by plastic cuffs that cut into his skin. His shouting had become hoarse, broken by gasps for breath, yet the words still came in bursts of fury. "They're all liars! All of them! You'll see!" Each time he shouted, passengers flinched. The mother in seat 19C held her crying child tightly against her shoulder, whispering prayers through trembling lips. Across the aisle, an elderly man clutched his wife's hand, his knuckles white. The flight attendants moved with quiet urgency, their professionalism masking the adrenaline pounding through their veins. Claire, the lead attendant, pressed her hand to her earpiece and spoke rapidly into the intercom that connected her to the cockpit. "Captain, suspect restrained. Situation unstable. He keeps yelling threats. We need to land soon." From the cockpit, the captain's reply came instantly, calm but decisive. "Understood. We've declared a level 2 emergency. ATC has cleared us to divert to Lyon. Prepare for descent and secure the cabin." Claire turned to the other crew members. "Everyone stays buckled until I say otherwise. Lock the galley. Keep passengers calm." Her voice didn't tremble, though her heart was hammering in her chest. The two men who had helped subdue the suspect remained close by, watching him closely. One of them, a former security guard named Marcus, held a hand on the man's shoulder. "Don't move, all right? Just breathe." But the restrained man's eyes darted wildly from face to face. He was sweating, muttering broken sentences, half political slogans, half nonsense. "They think they can hide it. Not anymore. Not after this." The engines roared louder as the captain began a rapid but controlled descent. The plane tilted downward slightly, enough that a few unsecured items slid across tray tables. The seatbelt sign glowed bright red. "Ladies and gentlemen," came the captain's voice over the speaker, calm but firm. "For your safety, we are making an unscheduled landing. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened." He didn't mention the word emergency. He didn't have to. Everyone already knew. A ripple of panic moved through the cabin anyway. "What's happening?" whispered one passenger. "Are we crashing?" another asked. The attendants moved row by row, crouching beside frightened passengers, using low, steady voices to reassure them. "Everything's under control. The captain is trained for this. We're landing safely, all right?" But their eyes betrayed the truth. This was not ordinary turbulence, not a medical emergency. This was something darker, something unpredictable. The restrained man suddenly jerked forward, yelling again, "You think you can silence me? I'll tell the world!" Marcus pushed him back against the seat. "Enough!" he barked, louder than he meant to. The outburst startled the nearby passengers, but it stopped the man cold. His head dropped, shoulders shaking as he mumbled incoherently. At the rear of the aircraft, another attendant quietly checked the lavatories and galley for any suspicious items, just in case. Training dictated it. Verify, double-check, stay ahead of fear. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened each compartment, half expecting to find something. Each time it was empty. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, the captain's focus was razor-sharp. "Altitude 10,000 and descending," his first officer confirmed. "Notify Lion Control we're inbound emergency. Request priority landing and police on arrival," the captain replied. Outside, the clouds were thinning, revealing the patchwork of French countryside below. The descent felt steeper now. Oxygen masks weren't needed, but the pressure in everyone's ears reminded them just how fast they were dropping. Back in the cabin, the crying child had quieted, exhausted by fear. A teenager in the back crossed himself. A businesswoman closed her laptop and gripped the armrest, staring at the fastened seatbelt light like it was her last anchor to normalcy. Claire walked the aisle one last time, steadying herself as the plane jolted through another pocket of turbulence. She checked on the man in 18B, still restrained, still muttering. His head rolled back against the seat, eyes half open, lost in whatever storm was raging inside his mind. She leaned toward Marcus. "We're 15 minutes from landing. If he tries anything again, you hold him. I'll help," he nodded. "Understood." Another jolt. Gasps rippled through the cabin. The man in 18B suddenly screamed again, a guttural sound of rage and despair. "They'll know! You can't stop it!" Every heart in the cabin seemed to skip a beat. Claire snapped her fingers toward a colleague. "Blanket. Now." They grabbed a spare blanket and wrapped it around the man's arms and torso, pinning him further into his seat without causing harm. It muffled his movement and dulled the sound of his voice. It was something small, but it gave passengers a sense that the crew had things under control. 10 minutes later, the first glimpse of land appeared through the windows. Fields, highways, the faint sparkle of the Rhone River winding toward Lyon. The captain's voice returned. "Lower and steadier now. Cabin crew, prepare for landing." Claire's throat tightened. She looked around the cabin. Dozens of faces stared back at her, frightened, pale, exhausted, yet trusting her completely. That trust meant everything. She smiled faintly and said, "Almost there, everyone." Deep breaths. As the landing gear extended with a heavy clunk, the restrained man began to cry softly. His anger had burned away, replaced by confusion. "I didn't mean it," he whispered, barely audible. "I didn't mean it." The wheels touched the runway moments later with a jarring thud. The engines roared in reverse, the plane shuddering as it slowed. Through the windows, blue lights flashed, police vehicles racing alongside the aircraft. A collective gasp of relief swept through the cabin. Some passengers clapped weakly, others simply closed their eyes. But the flight crew stayed focused, holding position until ground security gave the all clear. The panic in the sky was ending, but its echoes would stay with everyone who had lived through those long, unbearable minutes above the clouds. The wheels of EasyJet Flight 202 touched down with a jarring thud on the runway at Lyon-Saint-Exupéry Airport. For a split second, no one breathed. The engines roared in reverse thrust, the aircraft vibrating as it slowed rapidly across the tarmac. Then, as the nose dipped slightly, the sound softened into a steady hum. the signal that they were safely on the ground. Inside the cabin, a wave of relief spread like oxygen. Some passengers clapped. Others whispered prayers of gratitude. The crying child in row 19 fell silent, eyes wide but calm now in his mother's arms. The elderly couple clasped hands and bowed their heads. Everyone could feel it. The nightmare in the sky was finally over, but it wasn't finished just yet. Outside the windows, flashing blue and red lights danced across the runway. French gendarmes, armed police in dark uniforms, surrounded the aircraft. Their vehicles came to a halt in a semicircle around the plane, blocking any possible escape. A stair truck rolled quickly toward the front door, followed by an ambulance and a white van marked Police Nationale. The intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain announced, his voice controlled but solemn, "for your safety, please remain seated. Authorities are boarding the aircraft to handle the situation. Cabin crew, stand by." The passengers froze. Some turned to look toward row 18, where the restrained man sat slumped against the seat back. His head hung low, wrists still bound by the plastic cuffs. The earlier rage in his face had drained away, leaving only exhaustion and a strange, distant emptiness. Claire, the lead flight attendant, took a slow breath. She had done her job, kept everyone safe, kept order, and somehow kept calm through it all. But now, as the sound of heavy boots echoed up the boarding stairs, she realized her hands were trembling. The front door opened with a metallic hiss. A burst of cold morning air rushed inside, carrying the scent of jet fuel and rain. The French police boarded swiftly, visors down, weapons holstered but ready. Their leader, a tall officer with a firm tone, spoke in clipped English. "Where is the suspect?" Claire pointed down the aisle. "Row 18, sir. Restrained. He's been shouting but hasn't moved for 10 minutes. The officer nodded once. He motioned to two others who advanced down the aisle with deliberate precision. The cabin went dead silent, except for the faint hum of the engines winding down. Every eye followed them as they approached the man. "Stand up," the officer ordered in French, then repeated in English. "Sir, stand up." The man didn't respond. He just blinked slowly, his lips moving faintly, muttering words no one could understand. When the officers lifted him, he didn't resist. His head drooped forward, his body limp, like all the fight had drained out of him somewhere above the clouds. They removed the temporary cuffs, replacing them with real steel handcuffs that clicked sharply around his wrists. Then, holding his arms tightly, they began escorting him toward the front of the plane. As he passed through the aisle, passengers stared, some in anger, some in disbelief, others with quiet pity. One man muttered, "He could have killed us." Another whispered, "He needs help, not punishment." The suspect said nothing. His face was pale, his eyes glassy. When they reached the open door, he turned once, just once, looking back into the cabin as if trying to remember what had just happened. Then the officers pushed him gently forward and led him down the steps into the cold air. A moment later, the door closed again. Inside, it was silent. No one spoke for several seconds. Then, almost spontaneously, applause broke out. It started with one person, then another, and soon the entire cabin was clapping. For the crew, for the passengers who helped, for the captain's steady hand. Claire smiled faintly, her eyes wet. The tension that had gripped her for the last 45 minutes finally loosened. The captain's voice came over the intercom one last time. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your cooperation and courage. We'll be disembarking shortly once authorities finish their checks. You've all been incredibly brave." Outside, police dogs circled the aircraft, while technicians checked the cargo hold for any threats. Nothing was found. After 15 minutes, ground control cleared the passengers to exit. Row by row, as they stepped out onto the tarmac, most of them looked around. The sky above Lyon was calm, painted soft blue and gold by the morning sun. It was hard to believe that less than an hour ago, that same sky had been filled with shouting, fear, and uncertainty. Some passengers hugged the crew before leaving. "Thank you," said the woman from row 18A, her voice shaking. "You saved us all," Claire smiled gently. "We just did what we were trained to do, ma'am. I'm glad you're safe." Later that afternoon, French authorities issued a statement. The man had been identified as a 36-year-old British national traveling alone. Tests revealed his blood alcohol level was nearly 3 times the legal limit. Investigators found no explosives, no weapons, only a phone, a passport, and a few personal items. He had been intoxicated and mentally unstable, officials said. The outburst was fueled by anger, confusion, and fear, not terrorism. Still, the charge was serious, endangering the safety of an aircraft and its passengers. News channels across Europe picked up the story. Headlines read, "EasyJet flight diverted after passenger shouts, 'Death to Trump,' mid-air." Videos recorded by passengers went viral within hours, showing snippets of the chaos, the yelling, the crew rushing down the aisle, the moment of the arrest. For the world, it was just another headline. But for those who had been on Flight 202, it was something they would never forget. That short 45-minute flight had felt like an eternity, a stretch of sky where time slowed. Fear grew heavy, and courage quietly held everything together. As the last passengers stepped into the terminal, one of them looked back through the window at the orange EasyJet plane parked on the runway. The engines were off now, the cabin empty, but in that silence lingered the echo of everything they had survived.